Hello everybody. Today I am driving a car that at its launch 30 years ago became one of the most important Aston Martin had ever made, but now is often completely forgotten. And for a very long time, it could have been argued that the only reason anybody ever bought a DB7 is because they were the cheapest way to get yourself into Aston Martin ownership. But now that appears to no longer be the case. Is the DB7 a car still worth considering? Let's find out. I expect there is a fairly good chance you're familiar with the story behind this car, but just in case you're not, I'll give you the brief version. In the 1980s, Aston Martin was owned by a man called Victor Gauntlet, and the company was producing the likes of the V8 and V8 Vantage, big brutes of cars, handmade by men called Ken, Brian and Dave. They were wondrous things, but they were also incredibly expensive, costing far more than the average house did back then, and as a result, Aston Martin sales were glacial, even by the standards of, say, Ferrari. Now, Mr. Gauntlet was not unaware of this fact, and he said many times that there were plans to build a more volume production Aston Martin at a lower price. But the simple fact was, the company never really had the money to develop such a car, until that is, in 1987, when Ford bought the firm. The first thing that they did was to modernise the V8 line and turn it into what was first called the Virage and later simply the V8 and V8 Vantage, of which I have driven a twin supercharged example, the V550. And though from an aesthetic point of view, it's far from my favourite Aston, I do really rather like it. These cars, though, were still just as expensive as their predecessors, and of course Ford knew they really had to get this lower-priced Aston out if the company was going to be viable. Help then appeared from the unlikeliest of places, Tom Walkinshaw, who by that point in time had made quite the name for himself, competing, rather successfully, Jaguar XJS's. This was a platform that in itself was already fairly old, dating back to the early 1970s, but he thought that it still had plenty of life left in it, and so he set about building a car that he figured Jaguar could use to keep the XJS going into the 90s and potentially beyond. That car was then presented to Jaguar, at the time also owned by Ford, who looked at it and said, yeah, nice idea, but you know, we've got our own, and they were still reeling from the disaster that was the XJ220, and they got cold feet and said, no, we're okay, thank you very much. So the car was then hastily restyled by one Ian Callum to look a little bit more like an Aston. It was presented to them and they said, hey, you know what? We'll take that. It's the perfect solution to our needs. It's effectively already developed. It uses pieces from other companies in the Ford empire. We can make something of this. And so they did. The car landed in 1994, and though many hailed it as one of the most beautiful ever made, they were also fairly quick to point out that this Aston Martin had underneath it a Jaguar XJS chassis, including the Jaguar suspension and effectively everything else. And perhaps even more embarrassingly, up front, you'd find a Jaguar engine. Yes, it was engineered and built by TWR. Here it's a straight six displacing 3.2 litres and with a supercharger bolted to it. But the simple fact is, as far as many were concerned, there wasn't really much Aston Martin-y about this car. Regardless, the customers certainly liked the idea of it, and it began to sell. Jaguar then realised that maybe they'd been a little bit too hasty, so said, actually, you know what, we will have that car you offered us, and a couple of years later, the XK8 and XKR arrived, which then gave the DB7 a little bit of a problem, because where this had a 6-cylinder engine and a 4-speed automatic or 5-speed manual, the Jaguar, which was considerably cheaper, had an 8-cylinder engine and in supercharged XKR guise made quite a bit more power too. It also had a much more modern 5-speed automatic with no manual option, and the implication was always that was only because they didn't really want it treading on Aston's toes too much. But in any case, the Jaguar was far better value and seemed to be the better engineered car. So Aston Martin pulled out another one of their legendary badges, the Vantage. Remember also that putting DB on this car was quite the statement. That was a badge that had been dormant for near 20 odd years, effectively since the demise of the DBS V8. And the DB7 Vantage is perhaps the most dramatic of all the old Vantages. That was a badge that was wheeled out for the performance variant of the older cars. And where with those you still got the same fundamental engine just reworked, here it was an all-new affair. Out went the 3.2-litre supercharged Jaguar 6, and in came a 5.9-litre all-aluminium naturally aspirated V12. Yeah, a proper engine. It put out 420 horsepower over this is 340, and as soon as it landed, I think everybody went, yeah, you know what, that's the one to have. The Vanquish then arrived a couple of years later, and then in 2003, 2004, the DB9 arrived, and at that point, these quickly became forgotten, with the early 6-cylinder models being considered by many as just, well, not a proper Aston, and therefore not worth your money. Which is a shame, really. I've always had a little bit of a weird soft spot for these because I think this is how the car was designed, and let's face it, an Aston with a straight 6 is a classic combination. We arrive now at my 3-point turn hill start torture test. This car has the fairly common 4-speed GM automatic, the 4GL80E, something like that. A gearbox that made an appearance in quite a few British cars, including many a Jag, of course, Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, and so on. It's a good gearbox, although the best thing I generally say about it is how much better it is than the 3-speed it usually replaced, which was an awful box. Now, being launched in 1994 meant that this car is often compared with the Ferrari F355 that landed the very same year, and was also a very big deal for its maker. But the truth is, the two are very, very different. In terms of power, the Ferrari makes another 40 horses, this 340, that 380, in spite of the fact the Ferrari has no supercharger, but 2 extra cylinders and another 300cc. Torque, though, is another story. This makes 361 pound-foot. That's 489 newton-meters, nearly 100 pounds-feet more than the F355, which, let's face it, in a big GT car, makes a lot more sense. And in all honesty, driving this car along, gently bimbling about, it's okay. But there are some issues. Now, this is not the first time that I've driven a DB7, but the last was the DB7 GT. That's the final run-out model with the V12 Vantage engine in it, and it's got a few tweaks to make it effectively the ultimate iteration of the DB7. And it was ultimate in the correct sense of the word too. That was the last one before the DB9 took over completely. And that, I recall, is a fairly decent car. But the fact is, if you go and buy a DB7 GT, you're going to be parting with about £50,000. And for that, you could have already had yourself any number of more modern Aston Martins, DB9, V8 Vantage, now almost V12 Vantage. You've made a conscious choice. But these are still just about the cheapest of all Astons. And the fact is that a while back you could buy one of these for very low teens, and a DB9 was still £40,000, £50,000 or more. Now though, these start at £17,000 to £20,000, and a DB9 starts at low 20s. And that is close enough that I would wager most people would probably rather wait it out and just get the 9, unless they had a particular thing for the 7. Which is not the case for this car's owner, Bart, who, when he got out of the car this morning, shocked me because he was about 30 years younger than I was expecting him to be. He's just 26, and I was amazed that a 26-year-old first off wanted a DB7, and secondly was able to afford the insurance. As it happens, that really isn't much of an issue at all. It's only £600 a year. Now, Bart's had a number of different cars over the years, including some of the usual suspects for a 20-odd-year-old, BMW M235i and so on. His current company car is a Tesla, and so his own car can therefore be something for the weekends, which means he doesn't have to worry about the tragic fuel consumption that is probably around about 22 the gallon at best. The car he wants is the DB9, but he's done what I probably would at his age and said, okay, right, I can't have the one I want, so what's the next best thing that I can afford? And that turned out to be this. And his plan is then to have this for a little bit, use it, enjoy it, do it up, fix some of the things that need fixing, and then sell it on, hopefully then able to buy the DB9 he's always wanted. This is a risky plan, because it involves hoping that before he can afford the DB9, this doesn't bankrupt him. And DB7s have a reputation for doing that. They are needy things. The story of the whole car is really quite weird. They weren't even built at the usual Aston Martin factory over in Newport Pagnell as it was at the time. They simply didn't have the capacity. So instead they took over a new facility, which was essentially some barns in a place called Bloxham. And on the internet today you will actually find a great video talking about the history of Bloxham. You'll get effectively a factory tour, but with it no longer being Aston, from a chap that used to work there. Video by the Aston Martin Heritage Trust. I'll put a link to it down below. It's really quite fascinating. But the whole thing is all very Heath Robinson. The cars, you got the feeling, weren't exactly put together to the same standard as, well, likely anything else in the Ford empire. And sat in here, you do get a sense of that. There's some lovely shapes and materials, leathers and suede or Alcantara, whatever it is, bits of wood and all that sort of stuff, with naturally a smattering of period Ford switchgear. But the fact is, the Ford stuff, and actually occasional bits of Mazda too, is what most people spend their time moaning about. And actually, they're the bits you should be thankful for, because I have it on reasonable authority, they're the bits that likely won't break, and if they do, you can get, and they're cheap. It's all the Aston Martin-y stuff that you need to worry about. These wood trims come apart and they degrade, they fall to bits essentially. Some of the roof lining and stuff like that can come down, and some of these things can be fixed relatively easily, but some of them not so much. The DB7 is a car regarded as fairly hard work to own. So what's it like to drive? Well, let's find out. I'm going to put the gearbox into sport mode for the little good that may do me and try and have some fun. This car is not a happy bunny. Now, it's been a long time since I drove that DB7, and as I said, it was a completely different DB7, but I don't remember it being anything like this. The engine is fine. The brakes, oh, they've had it. They've absolutely had it. Every time I try and put my foot down and slow this car, well, here, I'll show you. That's not good. They've been cooked. Now, this car does still need some work done to it. It's just come back from Bamford Rose, who weren't finished with it, but as the review had been organised, Bart wanted to get it to me, and oh yeah, this is not a happy car. The brakes are wrong. The suspension feels wrong. I mean, it's really ludicrously firm a lot of the time, this car, but the chassis, you can also tell, is really floppy, and then, oh, every time you brake, that's not nice at all. I do know these are famous for not being particularly rigid. I mean, this is a coupe. I can't imagine how bad the Volante is. Whether this is something that they did work to improve later on, I really don't know. But yeah, that's this is not a car that I'm enjoying driving, and it's rare that I say that. Now, let's ignore that for a second. What else can I say about it? Well, the interior, yes, does have a lot of nice shapes in it, but it's also very cramped. Not entirely unlike the XK, for obvious reasons. I'm 5'10", but with a long torso, oh crikey. And if you're 6 foot plus or so with a normal shaped torso, you are going to struggle. The rear seats, though, look like they might actually have a bit more headroom than in some of the later cars, DB9, DBS and so on. Yeah, that feels like a wheel's trying to come off. This is, oh, yeah, this is not a happy car. I'm going to turn this around and return it. And I fear that DB7 people are not going to be enjoying this video. I can actually reach the pedals, there's only 2 of course in this one, fairly easily. When the Vantage came in, you got a slightly better auto box, you got a 5-speed, and if you wanted a manual, it was then a 6-speed. Oh, yeah, this feels really, really unhappy. And this is a shame, and I feel really, really bad for Bart, because I know he's going to have to spend an awful lot more money on this car. And some of these things he'll be able to fix. Those brakes, he's definitely going to be able to fix. But the chassis is just inherently not very good. There's no other way to put it, really. People do like Astons. I'll give it that. And I can see why many people regard it as very, very pretty. I was never that fond of it, nor the XK of the time, which people also really, really like. I apologise if I haven't even given you any decent exhaust sound either, but there wasn't really anywhere obvious to put the camera on the back bumper. I do like the view out though. Reminds me a bit of the one you get in my 550, although that was a later car, so I suppose you should say that the 550 is a bit like the DB7. You got a nice big hump in the middle and then one on either side as well. Real classic British GT car view out there. The boot's also a good size. I'm very jealous of that. I wish that were the case in the DB9 and the like, but is not. You've got heated seats, that's nice to have. You have air conditioning, which is handy, although it doesn't work properly. The blower motor will only work on effectively its full setting, which is why it's either silent and then the car fogs up, or when I want to clear it, you can hear it. And the gauges are all in the right place, I suppose. Battery's good, oil pressure's good, temperature's good. But yeah, this car's not right. And you know what? Even if it were, I think anybody coming to me, unless they really, 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 really want a DB7, and that's the car they have to have, I would, I would push them to the DB9. I like these seats. They're a bit too narrow, but I actually prefer them over the later DB9 seats. The best DB9 seats were the really early ones. They were great, but Aston ditched them. The gearbox works fine. The engine works fine. Yeah. Sorry, DB7 fans. If somebody else has got one of these and they want to bring it to me because they're certain that maybe I'm being overly harsh on the car, or there were some changes made to the later cars, I'd genuinely love to revisit a later or different DB7 with the straight 6 or another Vantage. But for now though, I'm just going to try and get this home in one piece. So I want to say a big thanks to Bart for bringing it out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.